Good morning, everyone. I'm Leanne Beckwith, Swiftland's Continuing Education Coordinator, and I would like to welcome you all to today's webinar, Introduction to Digital Preservation, and today's presenter, Crystal Thomas. Crystal Thomas is the Digital Archivist at Florida State University Libraries under Special Collections and Archives. Her work is a mix of digital project creation and management, supervision of the Digital Library Center, and acting as a consultant for digital archiving project on campus. Crystal received her MSI from the University of Michigan in 2009. Please help me welcome Crystal and enjoy her webinar. Crystal?
Thank you. All right. Thank you for that introduction. As she said, my name is Crystal Thomas. I'm the digital archivist here at FSU Libraries. I've been here 7 years now, which is a little crazy to me. And today we're going to talk about digital preservation, sort of what is it not, and why should you care about it? And potentially what could you do with fairly limited resources to get started on dealing with your digital preservation needs. I did want to just take a moment and say that what I won't be getting into today is specific tools or specific procedures. I'll certainly point you towards resources where you could find that information, but I really just wanted to sort of stay big picture for today and tackle 4 main questions. What is not digital preservation? What is digital preservation? Why should you be concerned about it? And what could you do right now? So we'll go ahead and get started. So before we get to those sort of big questions, I wanted to take a minute and just sort of clarify some terminology. We throw digital in front of everything these days. And I did want to just say that today we'll be talking about digital archives, which is different than a digital library. A digital library is primarily built and designed for providing access to digital objects, whereas a digital archive is built and designed for long-term preservation of digital objects. That's not to say a digital archive cannot also operate as a digital library, but it's rare that it can go in the opposite direction, because really a digital archive is being built to focus on future users of the content. So it isn't always particularly public user friendly, because it's really worried about accessibility 20, 30, 50 years down the road and not accessibility today. So I just wanted to clarify that in case there was any confusion there. So next, what is not digital preservation? I figured we'll start with what it isn't, and then we'll move on to what it is. So what is it not? The first thing is that backups are not digital preservation. They're really there to restore in the case of a system failure today, whereas digital preservation is focused on long-term preservation of materials far beyond the idea of a system failure. Backups certainly should and can be part of a digital preservation plan, but it cannot be the start and the end of the plan, particularly if it is untested. So what I mean there is you should be testing periodically, restoring from your backups, making sure that process is actually working the way you think it is. The next thing that is not digital preservation is simply digitization. Again, you can digitize with preservation in mind, and you certainly should when you are doing digitization projects. But the idea of digitization is primarily about access rather than actual preservation actions being taken. And of course, when you digitize something, all of a sudden now you have more that you need to preserve long term. You have more digital files. And then lastly, I wanted to just note that putting something on external media is not completely preservation, particularly if you are never checking on the integrity of the objects that are on that media. So say you think you're good because you've put an entire digital project that you completed onto a hard drive and you put it in the closet and it's perfectly safe. But if you never touch that again or look at that again, you're going to probably run into issues. Will you even be able to access that hardware to play it again in the future? If you've put lots of stuff on those fun gold archival CDs in the past, How many of you still have CD drives that you can plug that CD into? Most new computers don't even have them. So thinking through what is not preservation can be helpful as you move through this process of figuring out where you're at. So if that is what is not preservation, what is digital preservation exactly? Ooh, it's a little over. Sorry, the font got a little wonky on you guys. So digital preservation is an active and ongoing process to manage all of your digital objects and ensure continued accessibility to those objects over time. So this is not a process that you can kind of do now and sort of put on automatic and never think about again. This really takes a lot of work and time and resources and expertise to do correctly. I also wanted to define what I mean when I say digital object. A digital object is both the file that you're preserving, so say a image file or a PDF, and then the metadata that you need over time to manage that file. You need that metadata for various reasons. You need technical metadata. You can't do much with that file if you don't know if it is a TIFF or a PDF or a JPEG. You need some descriptive metadata so you know why on earth you're even keeping it. And then you need to keep track of what's been done with that file in the past, so the administrative metadata. And all of that together is what we define as a digital object. Digital preservation is also work that is based on internationally recognized standards and models, such as the one pictured here. So this is the OAIS model, or OAIS stands for Open Archival Information System. This is where we get that fun terminology you've probably all heard, the SIPs, APEs, and DIPs. These models provide us with a common set of concepts and definitions to help discussion across groups when we're talking about digital preservation. And it also helps archives create specifications for what their digital preservation programs are going to look like. So what would an ideal digital preservation program look like? What does it entail? What does it include? So it would ideally have multiple copies of your digital objects stored in various locations. The minimal ideal is that you have 2 copies of your digital objects in 2 different disaster threat zones, which is very important for the state of Florida, where we could potentially all get hit by the same hurricane. The ideal is 6 copies, or even 7, depending on which standard you look at, which can be a lot of resources in trying to find a place to put 6 different full copies of your digital objects all over the world. The other ideal program would have standards for common or normalized file formats, and we'll talk more about file formats in a second. It will have metadata for every object that you are keeping. It will also have controlled and known storage of content. And you sort of have 3 objects there. You have offline storage, which is those CDs, magnetic tapes, external hard drives. These are not very scalable, particularly if you are at a large organization. You can't have a closet full of hundreds of hard drives that you are continually having to access and make sure are still working. Nearline storage is stored on offline media, but sending data in and out is done via an online interface. So Amazon Glacier is an example of nearline storage. And then online storage could be network storage or cloud storage, or paying into some sort of digital preservation service that will take care of a lot of that thought for you. So those are kind of the ideal characteristics of a program. What are those characteristics doing? What is that helping you do? So digital preservation is all about active management of your digital objects over time. And what does that mean exactly? It means that you're monitoring the integrity of your objects. So that's looking at the bit level of these files, making sure that nothing has been changed or become corrupt over time. You're also managing the security to your digital preservation objects, which is very different than the security needed to access public copies. You're making sure the authenticity or the provenance of your files is not compromised. That means documenting where did this object come from, what has been done to it over time, and why did you do those actions. And then lastly, as part of the monitoring authenticity, you may at some point need to migrate a file to a different file format or to a different storage location over time. So that's all very hands-on work. That takes a lot of, again, time and energy and effort on your part or the part of your organization to make sure that the digital preservation program is being successful. So we're going to talk a little bit about file formats, as I said, and sort of what do you need to be thinking through when it comes to digital preservation and choosing file formats for that kind of a program. And the first question is always open source versus proprietary file formats. This isn't always as straightforward and clear as you think. For example, technically the TIFF file format, which is the preservation standard for still images, is a proprietary format. But due to other factors, it has become that preferred format for preservation. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move down the list on this slide. Mainly for the second bullet point, actually. The availability of documentation on a file format is why the TIFF file format wins, I guess, wins in quotes. Although it is owned by a privately owned company, we as a digital preservation community have access to all of the documentation about that file format, meaning we can provide access to it even if the company that owns it disappears. Another example of this is the PDF file format in Adobe. There are two really great resources when it comes to file formats. One is the Library of Congress's recommended format statement. This was actually just updated this summer, in which they go through and tell you their recommended file formats for still images, for text documents, for music files, for video files, all kinds of different types of content that you may have on hand. Another great resource is called Pronom, Pronom, all caps. This is a sort of wiki that is maintained by the digital preservation community. That's a really great resource if you have file formats that you don't know what they are. And you're like, how do I access this? What on earth do I have? Pronom is a well-maintained resource for sort of figuring out if you've got some weird file formats, what you might need to do with them. You also want to think about adoption when you're choosing file formats. How widely is the format used? The more adoption in the community, the better. It means that more people are going to need to work on the problem of perpetual access to that format. And that means a lot more brains than just you have to worry about it. So that's usually a good thing to sort of take into account. You also want to think about the lossless versus lossy. So usually lossless is for your masters and lossy is for your access. So another example using TIFF. TIFF is a lossless format, whereas JPEG, which is often used for providing access to our still images, are lossy formats. A good question to ask is, does the file format allow you to embed metadata into it? That's a really good way to make sure you don't lose metadata as this digital object moves through time. And then lastly, you should sort of think to yourself, sort of, what are the significant properties of the file formats that you're using? You potentially don't need to commit to saving an exact copy. But you will need to save a copy that has meaning and value to a future user. So an example of what I mean here is we often will save an email as a PDF file for the archive because we know how to better preserve the PDF file, and that is preserving the essential content of the email in a way that we feel more confident about than, say, a proprietary email file format that we may have gotten out of the system originally. I also just wanted to touch on file naming conventions a little. This is one of my pet peeves, so I wanted to make sure I went over it with you all. The couple of keys here are to be consistent with your file naming. Don't change it up all the time. Don't have a completely different file naming convention for one project and then change it for the next. The more consistent you are, the easier you're actually going to know what you have at the end of the day. Make sure that you're following good computing rules. Your file name should not have spaces or weird characters, as those can cause access issues in the future. Computers don't like spaces in file names. Those can cause a lot of problems and potentially not allow the computer to open up that file in the future. You should have a file naming convention that's well documented for your organization, particularly for digitization projects, and you should make sure that people are educated on it and that they use it consistently. And also, whenever possible and applicable, your file name should be an important part of the metadata for your file. For example, in, say, a digitization project, we really would like our file names to be able to lead us to that physical item from the file name. So the example I have on the screen here is the file name for folder 1 in box 1 in a collection that is numbered MSS 2019-001. That means if it ever got separated from the rest of its fellows, we would still know what that file is and where it belongs in our hierarchies. This sort of file naming convention will also help you avoid having lots of image 001s. For each project, you want to not have such generic names that when you open up a folder, you have absolutely no idea what you have because you just have a bunch of things named images with numbers after them. It's also a good idea not to rely on directory naming to make sure that you always know what files you have. It's entirely possible images could get separated from their parent directories at some point, and then you'll just have 20 image 001s that have no parent and you have no idea what they all are. So that's why having some good file naming conventions written out will help you in the long run when it comes to digital preservation. So now that we've talked about what digital preservation is and it isn't, why should you be concerned? What's going on that this is becoming more and more a pressing problem? There's so many reasons why. Because there's so many ways that this could go wrong. The first thing to keep in mind is that everyone is creating digital records all the time. And due to rapid technology change, that means that obsolescence of those files is a guarantee. At some point, we won't have that file format anymore, probably. So you constantly have to be on guard in some ways to know what you have in your collections and know what might be gone next week and you have to deal with it now. Also, failures are not your friend when it comes to digital preservation. You can have technical failures with your storage media, with your ingest process, with your transfer process. There's lots of places in digital preservation that little things could go wrong and cause big problems. Also, digital objects are really complex. I have here file format complexity. And that simply means that you are tracking a lot of different information with your digital objects that have a lot of layers to them. I mean, you might successfully save both the file and the metadata, but do you need a specific operating system? Do you need a specific piece of software to access that file? Does that software even still exist? There are lots of places where you might be missing certain pieces if you aren't keeping on top of what you have in your inventory. Another possible downfall is us. Humans always mean well, but we're often part of the problem. We delete things, we alter things that we don't mean to do. We can cause corruption of files a lot easier than would probably be a good idea. And we also tend to be kind of poor managers of our own digital files. So we can be a big part of the problem. Legally, you may need to be able to access these digital objects forever. So are you risking non-compliance by not being on top of digital preservation now is a good question. And also on the institutional level, legality can be important, but also it took a lot of resources to either make or acquire these digital objects. So there is a risk to the institution to lose them as well. Other problems can be natural disasters. We live in an area of the country that really needs to include digital preservation as part of our disaster planning and be really proactive about what we're doing when a hurricane is bearing down on us. Metadata can cause some problems. A lot of different people often create the metadata for our files and then they store it all around. It can be stored on local machines, it can be stored on network drives, it can be stored on external media. So it's actually really easy to misplace metadata, and that can cause problems down the road as well. And also, we can create poor metadata because sometimes we don't have metadata standards we're following, or we didn't train people well enough to know what information we needed them capturing. So metadata can also be problematic. And then lastly, and often the one that we are all concerned about, is institutional support and stability for digital preservation. It requires financial support. It requires the policies be in place so that when people leave, you aren't back at square one. And you really need the institution to understand and acknowledge what is needed to do this work, because it isn't easy and you are going to need support to do it well and to do it right. So, truth. Digital content is at risk from the moment it's created. It is dependent on hardware, software, and humans for access. And due to rapid technology changes, we have that threat of obsolescence from the moment of creation. And that, in a nutshell, is kind of why you can't simply back it up and never think about it ever again. So now we get to the more optimistic part of the presentation of what can you do right now. I really love this quote that I have on the slide. It's from Elizabeth Labaud. She's at the University of Southern Mississippi. And I love it because it says very clearly the truth. Doing something is better than doing absolutely nothing, because if you do something, then content will only maybe lost. Whereas if you really do absolutely nothing, you can guarantee that you will probably lose some, potentially all of your digital content over time. So doing something, even if it is sort of just worrying and doing little things, is better than doing nothing. But what can you do right now? Well, very easily, you can be proactive. The amount of digital objects in your organization is only going to increase probably exponentially over time. And another thing to keep in mind is that the older a digital object becomes, the more attention they'll probably need on a preservation front to still be accessible. So you can also just start to ask questions about what's already going on. If you think or know that your digital objects are being backed up, you should ask how. Where are those backups being stored? How often are those backups run? And what exactly is being backed up? Is the whole system being backed up? Are pieces of the system being backed up? And you should also ask whoever is running those backups to test restoring from them periodically to check that the process is actually working the way you think it's working. And you should also always kind of have in the back of your mind, exit strategies from whatever systems you are currently in, because no vendor or system is forever. And the more you're kind of always being really proactive and thinking about the future of these objects, the better off you're going to be in the long run. You can also do some education. I'm missing a page. All right, do some education. So be as involved as early as possible in the life of digital objects in your organization. Know what is being done, particularly with digitization projects in your organization. Make sure that they're thinking about digital preservation when they're selecting the file formats they're going to create, when they're thinking about the metadata standards that they're going to use for that project. You should also get to know your IT people really well, because they are your allies. They can be really great advocates for digital preservation as well, but they might not really understand what that means yet. So get to know them, get them on your side, and talk to them about what this actually entails when you talk about digital preservation. And you should also be discussing this with your acquisitions and processing colleagues. We are more and more handed hard drives rather than boxes of paper. So if this isn't something you're talking about with the folks who are bringing collections into your organization, the harder you're kind of making it on yourself and on them to provide access to that material over time. Digital preservation is kind of everyone's problem now, but it might be up to you to sort of start that conversation at your organization. And this is a really concrete thing. that you could do. It does not have to be fancy, but you can create an inventory because obviously you need to know what you already have so that you know what you have to do down the road. And like I said, this doesn't have to be fancy. I'm a fan of spreadsheets, and a spreadsheet will do the job really well here. You just want to start collecting sort of what collections do you have, where are those stored, what are the file formats in those collections, how big is that collection, how many gigabytes, how many terabytes. And that will be enough info to get you started down the road of thinking about digital preservation at your institution. And mainly because this sort of requires you to go on a bit of a scavenger hunt. You're going to have to hunt down digital objects that may live only on local computers, that may be on servers, that could be on third-party websites, could be on your own personal website, could be on external hard drives in the back closet. You're going to have to do some hunting to find all of this information and really start to write it down. You're going to also want to make sure that the inventory itself is not siloed. Make sure that you're storing it in a place that everyone in your organization can see it, can add to it if they need to, can give you notes or more information if they have about the collection. You want to make sure that you're not causing more problems if this is only stored on your local machine. And also, as you create the inventory, you can start to mark areas of concern with certain collections. You can mark where there may be potential copyright problems, where there's potential privacy or legal issues with the collection. It will help you start to see potentially what collections need to be dealt with sooner rather than later. So once you know what you have, you need to start working your way through the risks of those materials and what on earth are you actually going to do with all of this. And a digital preservation policy is going to help be very clear to both you and to your organization what you are agreeing to do, what you are agreeing to not do, and then how you're going to prioritize the work. And I always include the agreeing to what you're not going to do because something to keep in mind with this is that just because something is digital does not mean it has to be preserved forever. Archival appraisal and selection should still apply to these materials because we don't need to, but we certainly also can't afford to save everything. And of course, I'm sure someone will come back at you with the old adage, storage is cheap. That may or may not be true depending on how much storage you're actually talking about. But digital preservation is not cheap. It takes a lot of human resources. It takes time, it takes training, and it takes expertise to do this properly. So at no point is this a cheap thing to be doing. And a policy will help you kind of outline that sort of institutional buy-in that you need to do this right, and also outline that we're not going to save everything, and this is why. You should do your best to match your policy to your mission at your organization, but also to other policies you probably already have. Collection development, institutional priorities, what your core record and content types already are. You shouldn't be necessarily reinventing the wheel when you're working on your digital preservation policy. You're just thinking sort of in a new, more narrow focus. And also, lots of other institutions have already written and shared digital preservation policies online. You should look for comparable institutions to yourselves for guidance. And if you don't see one posted on their website, say, please ask them. A lot of institutions are starting this work themselves or actively doing it, but just haven't put information online yet. But they probably have information they're more than willing to share if you just ask them, where are you at when it comes to digital preservation, and do you have a policy? Another resource that you could look to for examples of policies is Library of Congress did an audit of digital preservation policies in 2013, which is a little old now. However, if you visit the institutions listed that they audited at the time, most likely they do have an updated policy that you could look at as you're getting started and looking for examples. And the sort of last thing to keep in mind as you're getting started is don't try to do all the things all at once. Digital preservation can be quite overwhelming when you start really looking at what you might have in-house and all the things that all the standards say you should be doing with them, and trying to tackle everything all at once is not going to be good for anyone. So something that you can do is start small. Do that inventory, actually track down everything. That's going to take some time. And then once you have the inventory, you're going to take some more time when it comes to the policy. And then is when you're going to actually sit down and be like, okay, where do we want to start? And you're going to want to start small. Focus on a single collection and potentially even just a single type of preservation activity. And when you have that small of a focus, you can experiment, you can learn, you can ask questions as things don't work the way you think they're going to. Another really great tool when you get to this stage is the NDSA has a levels of preservation that can help you sort of evaluate where you're at and also decide sort of what is the most important thing for you to focus on first. And throughout all of this sort of experimenting and starting small and being focused, you're collecting data, right? Everything that you learn, even when things go really wrong, is important. Because that data could someday help you go to your organization and say, look, it took us months to do this one thing for this one collection, and we have 100 more collections to go. It might actually be cheaper in the long run to pay to participate in a digital preservation service than to have you try and do everything by hand all by yourself in-house. So the more data you can collect, the more experience you get, the more you're going to be poised to be a really good advocate in your own organization for the resources needed to do digital preservation well. A lot of people are doing digital preservation and will be the first to admit we don't all know what we're doing, which can be a comforting thought. But you want to make sure that you're getting this right. So the more experimentation you can do, the more data you can do, will help you in the long term be able to advocate for what's actually going to be the right fit for your organization over time. And so, what are some resources as you get started down the path of digital preservation that will be helpful to you? So the Digital Preservation Coalition Handbook, which I believe is out of the United Kingdom, is a really great basic introduction to digital preservation. It's very approachable. It goes through all the different vocabulary you might come across. And it's really good if you're still struggling with the concepts. So it's a good starting point. If you are looking for some file format help, I listed the two resources I mentioned earlier here, the Library of Congress recommended format statement and then Pronom. Pronom is, I described it a little earlier, it's a format registry. So it can be helpful for questions about normalized or common formats, but it can also be really helpful if during your inventory you come across some really weird formats that you have never heard of before. Pronom will be a good place for you to go and kind of look and see what is this format and how do I access it and how do I preserve it. And then Copter is a tool repository. So once you've gotten to the stage where you're like, okay, we need something that will help us check fixity in our collections, you can go to Copter and you can look for all the tools they list that will check fixity for you. And then you can see reviews from others in the digital preservation community that have used that tool. You can get an idea of sort of how much technical expertise is needed to run that tool. Does it work the way advertised? I guess is a good way to put it. So Copter can be a really good place once you're ready to start doing the actual work of digital preservation to go see what tools are available. I also have here the link to the NDSA, so the National Digital Stewardship Alliance, which is a program now based out of the Digital Library Federation. It was at Library of Congress for a while. This is the levels of preservation that I mentioned. This can be really great once you have that inventory and policy in place to kind of go and set goals for your digital preservation program over time. I listed the Signal here, which is the Library of Congress's digital stewardship blog. That's where LOC shares their stories of digital preservation and shares information on new tools or standards that they are looking into. It's updated very regularly as well, so you can be sure to get up-to-date information from there. I also have here the Trustworthy Repositories Audit and Certification Criteria and Checklist, or TRAC, which you may have heard of. This is a very high-level checklist, so it might be a bit much to start from. But after you've been working on digital preservation in your organization for a while, this can really help you get a big picture of sort of where you're at and what you should be aiming for. It can be very aspirational, I guess is the word I'm looking for there. If you are at that stage and you want to look a little higher. I listed here a link for Premise, which is the international standard for metadata to support the preservation of digital objects and their long-term usability. This might be useful to look at as you are looking to supplement your current metadata practices for digital preservation or want to add certain fields. This is often can be added on to standards you may already be using. And then lastly, I added a link to the digital preservation at the Library Workflow Exchange. This is where institutions have come and shared their procedures and processes, so steps 1, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, that they actually do in-house for their digital preservation work. So once you are ready to start to actually do the work of digital preservation, which I didn't touch on here because I kept it very high level, this is a good place to go and take a look at how other institutions actually do the work. You will notice some similarities across the board, and then you'll see some really big differences in how different institutions approach the workflows for digital preservation. So it can be a really good place to sort of go and brainstorm, steal the good ideas and ignore the ones that aren't going to work for you. I always say we don't need to be reinventing the wheel. You should lean hard on those who've come before you and figured out the hard work, hard problems of digital preservation, and also add in any solutions that you find as you start working on this at your organizations. And with that, I am done. Thank you all. Are there any questions? Oh, thank you. I'm glad everyone found it interesting. I should be able to dig up an inventory spreadsheet example. I can send it to Swiftlin and they could share that out. Yes, Glenn, that is the Library Workflow Exchange. So that is an excellent resource that you should feel free to use to get ideas for workflows when it comes to digital preservation. And past, I think I see one up here about past perfect. Joe, it's been many years since I looked at past perfect. It's mainly used by museums, if I recall correctly. I am not sure in terms of how that program specifically works, if there's any digital preservation tools built into it, or if you do need to be thinking about how you extract your digital objects from Past Perfect for digital preservation purposes. I'm willing to bet they've gotten that question though, so I would probably look at the Past Perfect website to start digging into answers for that question. But I have not used it in many years, so I don't know off the top of my head. Are there any digital preservation systems you recommend? That's always the question, isn't it? Um, so there is a wide range of digital preservation systems. We here at FSU are looking to implement Archivematica, which is an open source digital preservation system. And of course, open source is free like a puppy. It doesn't cost anything to download it, but it takes a lot of effort to actually get it up and running and maintained over time. Uh, so there is that aspect. There are others that would also work. We use Islandora for our digital library here, and Islandora does have um, functionality that would turn it into a digital archive platform potentially. There are also the ones that cost a bit more. Preservica comes to mind, which I have heard is excellent, but it does come with a price tag. So there is a wide range of digital preservation systems. There are also collaborative digital preservation groups that you could look into. Meta Archive is one, AP Trust is another. Those often can be expensive depending upon your institution size, but they work just as well as any other system you might pay for through a vendor or if you're not able to run things in-house. Um, so I haven't used all of them personally, but I would recommend sort of just digging in, asking questions. It's usually pretty easy to find institutions that are using certain systems if there's one or two you're really interested in, and they're usually more than willing to answer questions that you may have about actually using the system. Are there any further questions? Yes, digital preservation can be quite overwhelming for small organizations in particular, Sonia. I feel that. Um, I would really recommend starting with that inventory. It doesn't have to be done in a day. It will probably take some time, but the first step is always knowing what you have already. Because if you don't know what you have, then you there's nowhere to go really. So I really recommend taking the time to do a proper inventory of, what digital objects do you already have, and thinking about what you've already got in house, and then going from there. And sometimes that might be as far as you can go. You can make a list sort of what you've got. Um, and maybe that is all you can do right now, but that's better than nothing. And it could be once you have that inventory, you might have a pretty stable digital object environment. I can't make any promises, but if you've got a lot of, say, PDFs and JPEGs or TIFFs, you're probably okay for a while yet before you need to start worrying. Again, no guarantees, that could change tomorrow. But you're probably doing okay as long as you know they exist and you know you're aware of what you've got, and you're just kind of keeping an eye on it and checking periodically that you can still access everything. Um, that is really the first step, and it might take you a while, and it might not. But if that's all you can do, that's all you can do. But having at least that in your back pocket to go back to and know what's going on can be really handy over time. So, what needs to be identified in the inventory? This can be really simple. It doesn't have to be giant amounts of information. Just open up a spreadsheet and create some columns. You're going to want a column for your collection name. You're going to want a column for what file formats are in that collection. A column to kind of say how big is the collection? Is it a gigabyte of information? Is it 2 gigabytes? How big is that collection? And then like a little description is probably useful too, like what content is in this collection. And then that really is sort of your base for the inventory. You might also create a column. I usually call it notes. And that can be the column where you kind of dump information as you need it. You know, are there copyright concerns with that collection? Are there privacy concerns? Does it potentially have social security numbers or credit card numbers? Um, are there potentially file formats in that collection that are more concerning than other collections? And that could be the collection that you actually need to sit down and figure out what to do with, while all the rest can kind of hang in stasis. And then lastly, the column I forgot, I always forget it, is sort of where is this collection? You want to make sure that you actually know where that collection lives in your digital environment. Does it live on Joe Smith's computer only? Does it live on your website only? Where does this stuff actually live? That can also be something where you want to, that could be a really easy thing once you have an inventory and say, we don't want to keep collections only on a single computer. What if something happened to Joe Smith? What if he won the lottery tomorrow and he called in and he's like, I'm never coming back to work? How do you get the information off his computer then? So you generally want to make sure that access to your collections isn't dependent upon a single person. And your inventory might help you find that. And that's actually something that's really easy to solve in some ways. You could create a Google Drive space for your organization, and everyone puts all of the useful information for your organization into a single location, and you update the inventory accordingly. So it could be the inventory brings out some really easy things to fix that you didn't really even realize was going on until you sat down and did the inventory. So that's why I suggest that. And I think it is a very attainable action even for the smallest organizations. It might take time, don't get me wrong. It might not be something you can do in a day or in a week, but I think it is a worthwhile thing to do. Any further questions? Happy to help, Sonia. Well, if there are no more questions, I got done early, so you guys get some time back in your day. So that's always exciting.
All right, thank you, Crystal, for the 4-minute webinar. Attendees, we encourage you to keep an eye on the Swiftland Continuing Education calendar, Swiftland Facebook page, and your messages from the listserv for more webinars. Thank you everyone for attending and have a terrific rest of your day.